Sure. And we'll turn it over to Nelia.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks, Michelle, for being here, despite everything that's sort of going on. I won't go into that, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're like as Sue mentioned, we're in our third part of this, and I should say part 3, actually, not part 2, but we'll fix that. So welcome and opening, right? As you know, I'm at the University of Colorado, Denver. I do a little bit of work for Temple University. I do a little bit of consulting work outside of that too. And I kind of, my world is really in this idea of sort of Title IX, Title VII, equity, diversity, inclusion. Like, so I kind of have an interesting role in that. I have both a foot in compliance and also in this idea of sort of advocacy, right, which is tied into this DEI work. So our vision for our space, I know I've gone over this a lot and you're going to keep hearing it from me, is about connection, collaboration, and consideration. Right. Today's agenda, this will look a lot like what you've been used to with some differences. Obviously, we're going to go through group agreements. We'll do that at every session. We'll do a bit of homework debrief. We're going to talk finally, I hope today, about JEDI base setting, which we didn't get to last time. We're going to look at a sample JEDI organizational action plan, both at the individual and the organizational level. We'll get into sort of community Q&A. I do have some homework for our last session, and then we'll get to closing and what that will look like. So, community norms, again, you should all be familiar with these. You know, it's about leaning into difficult conversations, being accountable for the impacts of our actions and our words, not making assumptions about other people's identities, accepting a lack of closure. This work is never done. This work is ongoing. Agreeing that what is shared here stays here, but what is learned here will leave here. Believing that everyone is doing their best, critiquing ideas and not people, and using I statements. Those tend to help to kind of bring that back to sort of centering the issue about you as opposed to sort of calling people out, and then taking care of yourself and taking breaks when you need to. In this virtual world, I don't think we do that enough. So for those of you that need to get up, stretch, be away from the camera, turning it on or off, I'm not making any assumptions about that. So feel free to do as you see fit. This idea of fumbling forward, again, we'll talk about that because we want to create a space where we can sort of give each other the grace to make mistakes. And this comes from a good friend of mine, as I mentioned, Donna Mejia, who's an associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Colorado Boulder. She uses this model of fumbling forward, which is really kind of to make a social contract with a group of people to extend the benefit of the doubt to each other, right? So that we're not afraid to stumble, we're not afraid to make mistakes, we're not afraid to ask questions that we might think are really difficult. So the idea is that you allow people to fumble forward in this work, to suspend judgment and work together to address the issues, right? With the expectation that we might need some evidence to move the problem forward or may need to talk about it a little bit more. So we'll go over that, and you've all seen that. I'm going to go over the homework a bit. We're going to take a little bit of time on this. There'll be a lot of question and answers. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read it, but I am going to go over it anyway. So your first piece of homework from last time was to read the Inside Higher Ed article on becoming a more equity-minded leader, right? And really what this article expounds upon is this idea of the powerful movement that we're seeing right now and the rising number of people who are deeply passionate about equity and justice issues, who want to have a track record of DEI engagement and who are vocal and empowered and are active participants right now in what we're seeing as social justice movements. And the article goes on to further talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has really sort of unmasked this widespread systemic racial inequity, right? That really targeted marginalized populations or minoritized populations who really have experienced the kind of negative impacts of the virus at these grossly disproportionate rates. So that, again, the article talks about was added to sort of what 2020 was kind of annus horribilis, if I get my Latin right? But the highly publicized deaths of African Americans at the hands of police that sort of sparked additional worldwide outrage. And then, so in general, the article goes sort of, we're seeing more industries and universities, everybody's sort of organizing actively around these issues of racial equity and demanding that universities and other organizations respond in kind, right? So again, I'm just reading from the article, sort of these university presidents, CEOs of corporations are kind of, and other leaders of all kinds are looking to have this experience brought into their organizations to address these issues. So the question for you, right, is both as leaders in your own right and leaders in Kiwanis, is how do you ensure you're promoting equity and inclusion, both in your current institutions and in your mentees' future workplaces and gathering places. So the idea is that we need equity-minded leaders more than ever. We've driven that point home both in our training and in the last few modules. So the article offers some strategies to focus on equity, which are sort of in line with what we talk about. And those were sort of educating yourself, right? Determining the equity issues that you're most passionate about and going beneath the surface to really understand them. So to make sure you have a solid foundation on such issues, right? So you start this by looking inward, for example. We've talked a lot about sort of educating yourself. Everybody can Google, everybody can question, and we're trying to set up systems here. There's a question we're going to ask you at the end, and I've been asking you in the last few modules, is let me know what you need to know about, because we'll get you the information you need so that you can educate yourself and start reading in the space. Reading books, accessing podcasts and blogs, listening to voices of BIPOC leaders in this field. Part 2 of this was to question how you've been contributing to an inequitable environment. So this really gets to sort of kind of self-reflection, right? We've been telling you from the beginning, right? Examine that unconscious bias and how it might be affecting your actions or lack thereof. There's some recommendations that are kind of consistent with some of the stuff we've been talking about in this article. For example, one book that deals with this is The Person You Mean to Be by Dolly Chugh. They talk about considering taking the implicit bias association test. That'll be part 2 of your homework today for next time, to further explore any potential bias you may have or you may not know you have. And then they actually, I don't know how many of you got to see the video. It was just a show of hands or in the chat. P&G, The Look. Anybody get to see that? If not, I wonder if there's any
I have this every time I see it, I feel the same way as me. And I can see it. How can I say this? I've seen it at least 100 times and I still feel the same way when I saw it the first time. It just always makes me put a lump in my throat and I feel some of the pain, and it's very impactful to me.
Yeah, it's really impactful. I have some questions. I just want to make sure everybody got a chance, because I can bring it up pretty quickly for those of you that haven't, if you think that would be helpful. I have some questions about what the video brings up, and I thank you, Gail, for sharing, obviously. I similar to that and the Joy DeGruy video, every time I look at them, I'm like, wow, right? That's worth watching again. All right, I'm going to pull it up. Let's see if I can do that. See if I can. I'm going to have to stop sharing here. And then I'm going to share the video. For those of you that didn't, I'm sorry, but it'd probably be good to watch it again. And I think I need to actually share my volume controls, right?
Correct.
Share sound. There we go. All right, I'm going to play it. Can anybody see that? Great. Yeah, it's pretty powerful video. So some of the questions the article asks us, of course, is sort of like, what did it bring up for you? I suppose I'll put that out to people. Anybody willing to share?
So for me, I honestly did not know where he was going to be in that courtroom at the end. And it was just like, oh, please don't let him be like a defendant or in handcuffs, or I didn't know what I was going to see.
I think it demonstrates that we assume so much by the color of people's skin and what they wear.
Yeah.
So my point to that is just that I can tell you personally, as a Black person, it's so much angst and, oh goodness, what's going to happen with this Black man? Like, what is he, what's going to be the deal with that in this particular video that we were looking at? So it's just angst around that for me.
I thought what made it so powerful is it showed so many different circumstances. It wasn't just one example. It just continued to show you throughout the day how he had to be on his guard and had to be aware of his surroundings and what was going on. And to Michelle's point too, it's at the very end, I'm like, where is this going? And that's why every time I see it, I just have, when I see him behind the bench there, every time I tear up.
It's kind of like, if you remember back to when we talked about unconscious bias and how those sort of lifelong stings, right? The constant sort of being on your guard, as Gail's talking about, how that sort of impacts you, like the kind of heaviness, there's just loads and loads of research that shows that kind of like heaviness sort of has deleterious health impacts, right? Like the kind of, you can't walk into a store without sort of being, and I don't know how it couldn't impact you. I don't know how a lifetime of being on your guard can impact you. The second question that the article asks is like, how do you see yourself in the situations it portrays, right? And Michelle, you got a little bit to it in sort of the idea of privilege, right? And walking into a store and not see that way that one fellow looked at him in the store when he's like sort of automatically suspect because of your skin color. You're walking into a store, so you're not, clearly you know where that was going. So any of you willing to share sort of, this is a real difficult question, I know. But again, remember, fumbling forward, safe space.
This is Greg. I need some help in reconciling a couple things. They talk about, your social identity, about age and gender and race and, sexual orientation and all of that stuff. And so, it's one of these things where I guess, we're identifying people based on that. And I guess I'm thinking about some of the phrases that have been used in the past that were kind of thrown out the window, like beauty is only skin deep. You can't judge a book by its cover, or the not the color of the skin, but the content of the character. And I'm looking, something else we're learning in some training is the whole, what they call the ladder of inference, where what you're doing is you're observing something and you're jumping to a conclusion, as opposed, and so what you're observing is this person is Black, this person is Asian, this person has a disability, and so rather than, and then you're selecting data and you're jumping to conclusions rather than interacting with that person individually. And so I think there's some things we're talking about. I like the article that Deborah Willis did, because they talk about talking to people individually about to interact with them. But that doesn't seem to be happening in society a lot. We're saying, okay, this person is white, therefore they're privileged automatically, boom. And so they're jumping to that conclusion, or this person is Black, so therefore I've got the danger or whatever, I've got to watch out. And people have said that about Muslims as well. And so I'm trying to reconcile how we're breaking people into categories or by genetics or look, but then we're supposed to, after doing that, then say, well, ignore that. That doesn't matter. But I'm trying to reconcile how we do this as individuals when society seems to be going in a different direction as how they're treating people.
Yeah, I think I get what you're talking about. I mean, it really goes back to this idea of implicit bias, right? We have mental schemas that get built based on the institutions we engage with, right? Which gets back to our 4-part equity module that kind of sort of builds those assumptions in us so that when we see a Black person or an Asian person or whatever, I mean, remember we played it out in the Google searches. I mean, I can tell you now, I can tell you to Google and I can show you the implicit assumptions playing out. Like look up Latin girls on Google. Tell me what comes up. Look up Asian women on Google and tell me what comes up. They're highly sexualized, they're highly fetishized, right? Look up the idea of masculinity. It's always tied to toxicity and like this idea of 6-pack, like even the idea, like you could replace the PNG video with something like somebody who is, well, this idea, for example, we could have used a similar example of fat shaming. Somebody could have walked into a store like that and said, well, we don't sell your size, right? There's an
Mhm.
implicit bias tied into that. What the video is trying to get at, right, is these kind of automatic constructs. And yeah, Greg, a lot of what you're saying, this idea of like talking to people, it's one of the things the article is talking about is like educate yourself, get out of your kind of circle, because we know we tend to combine with people that look and sound like us, right? And yeah, once you get beyond the kind of one story that are the implicit bias tells, we learn a lot about people. They're humans just like us. Absolutely. I get what you're saying.
But it just seems like some of these groups that are out there that you hear about, they're fomenting they're fomenting the group, identity, as opposed to encouraging people to talk individually to each other, and find out what the person's really like, or what I mean, just it's almost like, okay, this person in the video was Black, so therefore he can't possibly be a judge. Or why would, and so just that assumption is I don't know. We're not showing people how to take people at fate, for individuals. So
all the more reason to kind of focus not on just like how implicit bias plays out, but how we can start mitigating it, right? Like one of the things about that kind of really gets to me about trainings like this is like we come in, we sort of dump this on people and say, here's implicit bias, right? Racism exists. It's like, great. But how are we going to, then that's kind of performative allyship. It's like, I know about it and it's important and that I teach you to know about it. But like, how do we start moving beyond, right? This whole community of practice is really an idea that came out of Sue, was this idea so that we can move beyond and start talking about how to kind of really, you can't completely debias. I can't completely get rid of it. Nobody can. But, once you start understanding it exists, you like just this awakening of like, oh, wow, we're not even talking about this. How do you take that away? Because I'm not going to do it for you, but you can take it away to your communities and say, this really does exist. And here's a way to kind of move beyond it, or at least try to start moving beyond it. Does that make any sense? I mean, you're doing what
it does. I guess I'm just looking at the based on different groups, that you're guilty until proven innocent attitude. Because you're this is how you look, and this is, therefore these are the attributes we're giving you until you prove that you're not this type of person. So
yeah, and that's implicit bias at its best. I mean, that's what
Right.
we do as humans. We love to classify. We love
Right.
to put people into boxes and say, you're Black, therefore you're this. You're white, therefore you're this. You're that, therefore. Now, I'm not sitting here also and I'm like, if I wasn't controversial, I wouldn't be a good leader in this field. But like you talked about sort of whiteness, right? Like we did unpack white privilege and this idea that society is largely built, right, on the privilege of whiteness. So when I walk into a store, Greg, the idea is that I can find, like, I'm a white passing Latinx individual, right? I get that. I own that. I keep talking about that. So I'm not saying that I don't have that privilege. But when I walk into a store, Greg, it's really easy for me to find shampoo and conditioner in my style and shade, right? If I were to walk into that store as a Black person, usually my products are going to be at the back if they exist at all, right? And maybe even be behind a caged, locked area or something. Like, how does that, seriously, think about how would that make you feel? Like if you were to come into a store and all you had was products that didn't fit your phenotype. I mean, that's just an example, right? Of like what it would be like. So that's the kind of thing. So if you, and again, it's a way of looking at the world, right? Critical race theory would argue that there's sort of these implicit associations with the world we live in, right? That it's built primarily on this idea of whiteness, right? Because, and then it's also built on this idea of the invisibility of these other cultures that don't fit in. So, and I'm not saying you need to necessarily buy into it. You know, this work is about opening your mind in ways that your mind's going to be open, and I'm not going to convince anybody otherwise, but I do want to get you to start talking about it. And I appreciate the fact that we can at least do that.
Okay. I mean, I just might say that in the situation you gave, it might be a situation of economics. I mean, if you have, if during the course of a month you have, you know, 2 people walk in that want a particular product and that's all you have, you know, so I wouldn't necessarily jump and say, oh, this is a racist store because they don't have this product.
Yeah, it's about a lens you use, right? It's about a lens. I mean, I don't know. All I know is that sort of my training and that the world is built. My thing is that the world is built around people like me. It's easy for me to navigate this world. I don't have to walk into a Louis Vuitton store or wherever the hell that he was walking into and get that look, because no one's going to make that assumption. The implicit bias doesn't exist around somebody who's white or white passing, but implicit bias, right? We know it exists around somebody who's not. And kind of that's the issue the story was really telling, is just dealing with sort of that, right? And there's this history of it in this country anyway that really supports all of this. So when you start tying all of those together, you kind of at least look, it's about perspective taking too, right? You say like, my perspective is one and there's another perspective. So let's, getting back to your point about the fact that, yeah, I agree. We've even stopped talking about it because some of this stuff has become so politically divisive, probably in part to the last 4 years of our lives, right? And how things have been playing out. But I think the fact that we're willing to talk about it is probably a good start.
Okay.
So speaking of which, you're leading into the next thing the story was talking about. So it talks about using your privilege too, the story, right? And this idea is sort of, remember back for those of you that saw the 4-part series, the Joy DeGruy video, like simply unpacking something like her passing sister-in-law, Kathleen, and how she interrupted with the cashier during the interaction with the check cashing and the bad checkbook. So the simple demonstration of how someone with privilege can change a situation by simply asking a question, right? And then the article goes on to ask, like, in what ways have you actively used those privileges, both unearned and earned, right, to foster a more inclusive and equitable environment? And then more questions, sort of what consistent actions do you participate in that promote equity for marginalized or minoritized groups? So how do you show up as an ally? We talked about this, right? How to move on beyond performative allyship. All of us can be active allies and advocates for marginalized groups that we're not a member of. I'm doing that here today, right? In terms of how we sort of deal with these really difficult topics and take some of the tax off the backs of BIPOC people to kind of keep telling the story about how they get represented, right, in society. We talked a little bit about this before, and I think it's worth going over, right? Be careful that the work we're doing, right, is really about allyhood and not performative allyhood or performative allyship. So you want to keep marginalized, minoritized voices at the forefront of this work. So you want to strive to go beyond t-shirts and posts on social media. Yeah, social media plays a really important role in these movements, but it shouldn't stop there. Which is what the article is really trying to say. So, not expecting an applause or pat on the back for promoting a hashtag, right? That's sort of tied into one of these movements. And then the article goes on to talk about interacting with people outside your network. So Greg, this gets a little bit to what you're talking about, right? Taking a moment to look, there's actually a DI exercise around this I could take you through, sort of look at your contacts. I bet you if you were to list the top 10 contacts, it all look and sound like us, because that's kind of the way we're hardwired as humans. So who have you communicated with recently? What about your social media outlets? Whom are you following, right? Whom are you connected with on LinkedIn or other social media places? What groups are you a member of? Who's missing from those groups, right? And the article talks about, as an equity-minded leader, to be intentional about connecting with people who may be different than you, who look and sound who don't look and sound like you, getting to know that just one person can begin to change your perspective and your assumptions, Greg, along with what you're saying, right? To stop this immediate implicit association that we do with a Black person or an Asian person, or when we do fat shaming, whatever it is that happens in this work. Like once we get to beyond the kind of one story that implicit association tells us, right? Our mind tends to open up and say, wow, they're human just like us. And then again, it goes on, and there's a big theme in this article about not putting that work and beginning to educate ourselves about this. And then it goes on from interacting with people to teaching others, right? Sort of what we've learned. So you've been amazing participants in this sort of one-of-a-kind equity excellence program and community of practice. So we have one more session after that, and then we're going to take all of this and hopefully kind of see you embedded into your leadership practice. So once you've taken the time to educate yourself and have become active in moving this equity work forward in a way that resonates with you, committing to educating others, you've got a powerful voice. And it's important to remember that, not only because of your work with Kiwanis, but just your work sort of in other places. You hopefully will be equipped on some level to kind of speak in a way that's authoritative and where you can take this work forward and begin those difficult discussions, because often we don't even know where to start, right? And then part of the article towards the end, it talks about yielding to marginalized voices or minoritized voices. So take this moment, right, to give voice to those who've not been heard, right? Commit to work in the background to support people of color, BIPOC people. Nominate them for awards. These are excellent examples from the article. Donate money or time to their causes. Quote their works when you're publishing. Promote their ideas. Let their bosses know they're making an impact. Commit to sustained commitment in this work, right? We're no longer, when we're no longer together, question sort of yourself about how you're going to continue to promote equity. And research shows us, right, that if you write your commitment, if you set reminders, if you set goals, we talk a lot about KPIs in this work, right, that you're more likely to see outcomes from it. So just really good advice. Keep the article handy. It really gives you some great outlines about how to kind of begin as we talk about ending the community of practice, and how do you continue it? How do you embed this work, taking some of the principles we've all talked about? I have a commitment to all of you that I got from this article. I'm totally going to steal it, hopefully, because I think it's a good one, and I invite you to opt into this. So if you do, here's what I'm going to promise you, right? And I'm not going to need maple syrup, Lieutenant Governor Trimble, for this. I will write to you once a month for the next 12 months, reminding you that you made a commitment and giving you the opportunity to reflect on it. So I'm also going to commit to continuing the conversation on racial equity with up to 3 1-hour free check-ins with you over the next year. So that could be Q&A, that could be a check-in with me about things that you're working on. If you're willing to do that, I'm willing to give that to you as well, so that we can continue this in a less sort of formal way. The idea that if you continue to do the inner work and if you have that support from the outside, the commitment will continue to be sustained, and we'll continue to move this work forward together, right? Because I think we need that. I think we need places to decompress, because it's difficult work, it's hard work, and it's emotive work. And it takes some of this, I'm hoping to take some of this work off the backs of people who normally do it, so that we can take some of that charge off of them. And as we go over the work, I'm always going to remind you, right? So again, what did you take away? What new thing did you add to your leadership equity toolbox today? And what new thing have you sort of replayed or practiced or done? That will be some of the questions for those of you that want to opt in, so that we can do some reflection with you. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions at this point? And I've been talking a lot.
I'd just like to say, I just want to say that I appreciate that. The opt-in idea, because I don't know about anybody else, but since I took this, I've really been trying to live and breathe it and practice it. But I know I'm stumbling all over the place, to point, I went on vacation and we got into a conversation at dinner about, DEI, because I'm kind of I just try to talk about it wherever, right? And because I just feel like that's important, but I don't, I'm fumbling forward, I'm fumbling all over the place. And what I ended up doing was calling my daughter in the middle of it, because I thought, I can't remember one of the words. I don't think I'm getting the point across. So I called my daughter, who's 27, and she's much better at it than me. And I put it on speaker and I stuck the phone in the middle of the table. And I looked at the one gentleman, I said, say what you just said to me. And then I had my daughter respond, and it helped a lot. But she's not trained in it like you. So I think it's awesome if we have that ongoing connection with you, who I can, like, when I fumble, I can have like somebody still to go to help me kind of do a better job at, you know, communicating and keeping the conversation going.
Well, yeah, and here's the silver lining. You're willing to engage in that and begin, even if you're fumbling through it, you're willing to engage in it, which is important, that you don't sort of, you know, usually the response is fear, and it's like, I don't want to get involved. I'm just going to, whatever we say, I'm going to get somebody angry, or I'm not going to say it right. You're willing to engage. You had sort of a person you could call, and that's what I'm willing to do. So for those of you that do, again, you want to opt in, the idea, I'm going to remind you. So I would write to you once a month for the next 12 months, reminding you that you made a commitment, right? And giving you, because you spent a lot of time doing this. I can't imagine that all of you are here for a reason. And then giving you the opportunity to reflect on it. And then also I'm going to commit, so along that sort of monthly reminder, is that we'll have a conversation on any kind of equity topic you want. Sort of these hour check-ins, just kind of open clinic, whatever you want to call it, so that I can help you in any way you need. And, you know, think about it as a kind of a way for you to fine tune your practice. There's some exciting work actually I'm doing right now in a consulting capacity with another organization, where we're looking at, for example, some of the things like how an organization responds to these inequities, right? Like, what universities in particular do is we have sort of this one model, right? One model of like responding, and that's an investigation model. And I think most organizations have that too. Michelle and I are both trained mediators, right? We've worked together for years. So we're saying, hey, why aren't we bringing things like restorative circling and mediation into these spaces to use instead of the investigative model, which is like, if you imagine, like you take a harm, right? Like a discriminatory harm, and you say, that person is discriminated against me because I'm part of this protected class. And then we throw an investigation at it. And that what we do when we throw that investigation at it is we create even more kind of adversary, if you will, like, because now you become, forget about being discriminated against, you're discriminated against, and now you become a complainant in a process. And that person has become a defendant. And now everybody's at each other, and now it's a policy violation. And it's 6 months, and it's investigation, it's all this highly legal stuff. So what we're trying to do is kind of shift the focus to this compliance only, to say, how do we use harms in this work in a way that could help us, in a way that helps us kind of maybe use it on some level as a teachable moment, like to address the harms, because we know that these investigation only compliance models don't work at doing that. They don't address any of the harms. So just some of the exciting work that's happening in this space that could take our experience in a way, you know, just beyond training, that sort of hardwires it into organizations. Michelle recently became, Michelle, I don't know what your title is exactly at Temple, but she's really kind of the wayfinder for people. Like, it's a really exciting role to kind of help people find their way once they have been harmed, to find their way through the institution, to kind of get them to the right place so they're not telling their story 20 times. Does that make sense, Michelle, in describing what you're doing? Right.
Yes, I'm the Associate Director of Administration and Staff Affairs for the college, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Liaison with the university and the College of Education at Temple University.
So some exciting stuff is happening, and yeah, Jewel, so hopefully you're somebody that opts in, and I'll make sure that I put this in the email to Sue after. So let's move on, because we're still a little bit more, and I want to make sure that I capture most of it. So we went over that. So another homework debrief was just talking about this idea of how, you know, why do we value diversity? Why is it part of my values? For whom are we creating these more inclusive environments? That's an important question to always ask yourself. How we will ensure that inclusion is real and that we walk our talk, right? This idea of sustained commitment. And what systemic barriers exist that may limit or impede any diversity efforts you're taking? So how can we approach this work using equity as our guiding principle? What changes would that require? So what we talked about, and I won't ask the questions because we got it these last time, so I won't have an open discussion necessarily right now, but so we talked about this JEDI work, right? Where we answered part of this. So when I asked you to define equity, we used that Menti poll. So here's what came up, right? So we talked about equity as a process, outcome, or both. So in my work as a DI facilitator, I found that there's really a lot of widespread confusion about these terms. People get tripped up, again, not only on definitions, but on how to use the terms to create goals and action plans. And we are talking about creating goals and action plans for themselves and their organizations. So when we can't get on the same page, right, we can't take the next step. So we started with this idea of like, how do you define equity? You answered it. So we're getting things like same, access, being accountable, shared, proactive, opportunities, unbiased, fairness. And we started pulling around these terms. So what we find that equity really speaks to this idea of it's an approach, right? That everyone has access to the same opportunities. Equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist, and that as a result, we don't all start from the same place. Equity is this process that really kind of begins by acknowledging that there's an unequal starting place, and it makes a commitment to correct and address that imbalance. So this idea of advantages and barriers can often feel intangible. So some examples we used, right? For example, a study of hiring practices found that candidates with white sounding names, Greg and Emily, for example, were 50% more likely to receive a callback than candidates with African-American sounding names like Lakeisha or Jamal. Another study asked faculty scientists to evaluate candidates' competencies, whether they would mentor the candidate, and what they'd suggest as a starting salary. So the salary found that female candidates with resumes and criteria identical to male candidates were deemed less competent, less worthy of being hired, offered less career mentoring, and offered a lower starting salary. So again, right, we're seeing this playing out in these ways that tie into implicit bias and the way we tie all these biases to different genders, races, classes. So a thought exercise when you think about equity is really this. So think about a process in your organization in which you're a key player, right? Like hiring, promoting, or evaluating employees. Try to identify every touch point within that process where individual decision-making comes into play. So every point where you'd want to be as intentional and conscious as about your biases as possible. It's a good equity exercise for you to use when you're thinking about how to want to define it. So again, equity is really this idea of like access to the same opportunities, right? And then we asked you to define diversity, right? It's diversity really, and maybe I should ask this question again. So can you be a diverse organization and not inclusive? If you just throw that in the chat, yes or no. You're great students, absolutely, right? I know I've asked that question before, but yeah, diversity is really just the presence of difference. Like we're in a diverse room right now. We're not necessarily inclusive, although I'd like to think we are. You can have a sort of a diversity of species within an ecosystem, a diversity of clothing brands in your closet, or a diversity like of accountability measures, as I was talking about in a university system that deal with harms. Diversity is often used in this work as a euphemism, right? So people say we're diverse, you know, but we're not using it in the way I think that makes sense in kind of the world of DI. So we step away from the euphemism, right? But we want to be more diverse. It's like, sure you do, but like, how do you get there? It's not by being diverse. You get there through intentional inclusion, and you get there through sort of equity, right? And creating systems that promote equitable practices. So a thought exercise in diversity could be, for example, like think for a moment about the diversity of your own team or organization, right? What is it like? Make some notes on paper or document, right, that you've gotten from these exercises. And a follow-up question like, so you think about that team, right? How would your feelings and reactions change if you were of a different race or gender as part of that team, right? Orientation, sexual orientation, religion, any of the protected categories you want to think of. So when you think about diversity, you think about that. So again, to be a diverse organization or a diverse group or diverse team simply means that you have the presence of differences of identity, right? Gender, people of color throughout that space. And again, we can be diverse without being inclusive, and it's important to understand the distinction in the terms as we talk about this work and begin to build our goals around it. And you did a great job, incidentally, when here were some of the answers that I got from you. So this idea of variety, multiplicity, that really gets to it, multicultural, reflective, right? representation, dynamic, uniqueness. And then we asked you about inclusion, right? So this idea of like, what does inclusion look like? And you answered opportunity, barrier-free openness, integrated, included, practice, participant, integrating. Inclusion is about folks with different identities feeling or being valued and feeling like they belong, right? Leveraged and welcomed within a given setting. So that could be your team, your workplace, your industry. So if you think about it, diversity is kind of like being asked to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Inclusion is not a natural consequence of diversity. We keep driving that point home. So you can spend $200 million getting a diverse community of people into the door, but if you can't keep them and the environment they come into is toxic and they don't feel like they belong, it won't be money well spent. So efforts to increase diversity, for example, would involve questions like, right, to increase, as we talked about, and how do we get more people into our pipeline? How can we incentivize recruiting diverse candidates? So that gets you the diversity, right? But when you're talking about inclusion, it asks very different questions. So like, what's the experience, for example, for individuals who are minority within the organization? What barriers stand in the way of people with marginalized identities feeling a sense of welcome and belonging in our organization? So a thought exercise here would include how you would respond if someone asked you the following, right? We know that organization X can be a challenging place for people with marginalized identities. What is your company doing to change that? What is your organization? What is your unit? What is your team doing to change that? What efforts is your team, company, organization making to ensure that women, gender nonconforming individuals, and people of color, for example, feel included in the workplace? So again, pulling all these, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because I've been talking a lot. So while we've carefully pulled sort of this DEI terms apart, and I can't stress enough how important it is to get them right, there's still much confusion and conflation of these words in our everyday conversation. So I urge you to continue to explore the interconnectedness of them, but also to get them right. So when we talk about diversity, we all sort of are on the same page. So again, this understanding that diversity is really kind of a representation of difference, this inclusion, being kind of doing these almost like frequent internal checks, right? To make sure that there's a sense of belonging, and equity being about that process, right? About how we get to that space. And then all the questions and the thought exercises, I can send those to Sue for you as you kind of start reflecting on that, so that we make sure that we all are starting from that same space. I'm going to stop this for a second, just put some questions out there. So I know I'm going to follow the chat too. How are y'all feeling? How is your organization being inclusive? I don't care what organization it is, or your team or your unit. Anybody willing to share some best practices they're seeing or promising?
So I think for me, Nellie, one of the things that my organization is doing is creating committees and asking for those committee members to come together to meet, to make recommendations, to recommend things to the dean, and then for him to accept our recommendations and provide his feedback regarding what he thinks could be a plan to include our thoughts and contributions. So that, I know for me, that was one of the ways that I feel like my organization is trying to move towards inclusion.
Yeah, that's great, Michelle. Anybody else willing to share? Any best practices?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Greg.
No, I spoke already. Somebody else go first.
One of the things that we're doing right now, and I'm a teacher, and so they've started a thing called Unified Special Olympics, and the difference between that and Special Olympics is separate, and it only is for students with disabilities. Unified Special Olympics actually takes, so right now we just finished competing in track and field. So some of our best track and field members compete alongside with some of our students with disabilities. And it has made, so the interesting part of this is I really think it's done a lot to not only have the athletes from Special Olympics more included, and that, you know, they get included in the pep rallies for football and the pep rallies for the spring sports and everything like that. But I think a lot of the athletes that are willing to participate are actually some of our minority athletes, and they have been set, their actions, their genuine concern, and their genuine participation and being them. I think they're taking some of the things that how they've been treated and helping the students, if that makes sense. And it really is has been a great thing as far as the students are concerned. I think we have a longer way to go as far as faculty is concerned, and because of the community that I live in is quite closed-minded, but it is kind of opening the doors to other things. So anyway, it's been a great experience to witness.
Think about the importance, Renee. It's kind of interesting you said that about a closed community, right? Like not willing, but imagine like the difference between my going into that community, they don't know me from Jabib, and then you going to that community and saying, hey, I partook about this. Like, what about we look at it this way? Like, that's kind of like what I hope gets taken away from this, is you go back to your communities and like you become that authoritative voice, or, you know, constantly learning. I get it. I don't know everything in this work either. I mean, the first one to say that I'm constantly picking up information, but the fact that you have that ability, right? Because you've really got that relationship, kind of along the lines with actually what Greg was saying. It's like, how do you begin those discussions? Well, this is one way, right? You take this information back.
Right, and not losing the momentum that we've gained. So we've gained some momentum from actually 2 years into this, and our team went to state for track and field. But you know, as I'm looking at this and as we're having this discussion, I can only name two faculty members at the high school who are not like me. You know, we don't really have anybody for students to look, you know, we're not mirroring some of the things that we're learning, you know, through our hiring practices and everything. And so, you know, I worked in inner city last year, and you know, I come back and it's a bunch of people that are, you know, exactly like me. And I worked in an extremely diverse group and a very inclusive group last year. And so we're going to have to work a little harder, or a lot harder actually here.
Yeah. Well, the point is you're working, right? And that's kind of the role
Right.
of where we can all sort of make differences, right? So that we're not, again, I don't ever want fear to stop anybody from doing this work, because that's not going to help anybody. So we can get just even beyond that to kind of begin having the discussions. We're making progress in ways, maybe it's incremental. And yes, I'm not going to stop racism tomorrow by 5 o'clock. But I'm committed to trying, you know, the best we can to kind of get people, imbue people with kind of the idea of like, just even giving you the language to say, like, imagine going into a place that's like, wow, diversity, equity, and inclusion, like, God, they really are terms we use all the time. We drop them all the time. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is. It's like, yeah, we're really working to be more diverse. It's like, yeah, but how are you working to be more inclusive? Like, anybody could be diverse. You know,
Yeah.
Temple University, the University of Colorado Boulder, the University of Colorado Denver, the University of Colorado Springs, they're all diverse institutions. They're not inclusive, right? They're very different picture, or not necessarily inclusive, or as inclusive as they could be, because what happens, bar none, across all those institutions is they lose students of color and faculty of color more than they should be, right? Now, yeah, a lot of that has to do with the systemic stuff about the academy or the faculty and what it's reproducing, but still, it's something to pay attention to. Gail
I'd like-
saying, oh,
I'd
sorry,
like to speak about Kiwanis for a moment, if
Yeah.
that's all right.
sure, Lieutenant Governor.
Cut that out, Mila. You know, titles. It's interesting that Kiwanis refers to sometime in the 80s, they began to allow women to join. And I did some statistics on my division, which is Division 9 in the Greater Toronto area. And in 30 years, we have had 3 female lieutenant governors, and I'm one of them. We've never had anybody who's not white. And if you look at the number of governors in the district that I'm in, and Phil, you can speak up and confirm this data, there is a long list of governors who are men, but not a long list of women. So you're right. You can say you're diverse, but if you're not inclusive at the senior levels, then you're failing. I see some positives coming out of Kiwanis though, and I applaud this group of people for helping me because you have helped. You've given me connections into Kiwanis. Even just filling out some of the membership forms for the village has been a bit of a struggle. So, you know, like what, I want to go into it too much, but certainly Kiwanis International people have come back and said, well, don't fill the field out and that's fine. We don't have an issue with it.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something about Kiwanis too, because it's been kind of tough over the last year, but you know, Kiwanis has been known for doing hands-on service, volunteer service. And I think most of us can recall times when we've done hands-on service where we've invited the community and whoever shows up is we're working side by side with them to do it. It's very inclusive, I think. Now, what we don't do a good job of is once they're there is, I don't think we're good enough at, I'm going to use some business terms of networking or sales, so to speak, in the sense of really asking questions about who they are as people, to attract them to the club. You know, just, I mean, beyond the superficial, well, we're doing this work together, you know, helping these people, isn't this great? And so I think we need to do a better job of just be question and be inquisitive about other people in general. And I think that doing that when you have these opportunities to be inclusive in service projects, that you can find out about a person who's working side by side with you doing hands-on service, who they are as a person, if you just ask the questions and start a conversation.
Yeah, Greg, you're really talking to inclusion when you do that kind of work. You're networking, you're asking about their sense of belonging. You're really kind of creating that space. You're doing the work of inclusion.
And I think Kiwanians, as at least my experience is, they aren't good at networking, and they aren't good at asking people to join. Maybe they're afraid they're going to get a no. Well, the way I look at it is, if you don't ask, it's already a no. So I mean,
Right.
Nelia, just to continue on what Greg and Mary Ellen were talking about, and I don't want to sideline this conversation towards Kiwanis only, but certainly when we had Sue Peterson and Jane Andrews as our international presidents, we flourished as an organization, and we've had spin-off results resulting from their initiatives that they implemented in their years as our leaders. I'm finding, or I seem to find, I may be wrong, but I seem to find that women do not want to strive for the higher positions within our organization because of the pushback that they're going to receive from white men. And that's, you know, that's a harsh comment, but I think it's a reality. And I think it's something that women need to overcome. I'm particularly proud of our district. It's the youngest district in North America with the highest percentage of women in it. And we have to push women to strive for higher office. You know, even though I'm running against a woman who is a trustee, but I admire her because of what she's trying to do. She's trying to seek higher office, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm running against her. So in the end, though, we do need women to step up and be willing to take the risk of trying to achieve higher office, so that the norms in North American society can change slowly, just like DEI. I think this is going to take years and years for us as an organization to change how we look at our clubs, how they're run, and that they're not just a bunch of old white men running a club that is being exclusive instead of inclusive. Thank you.
That pushback's really interesting, Phil, that you talked about. So like, if you think about the impact of that, like kind of the unfairness of, like, if, I mean, I can't speak to what specifically it is. But, you know,
Well, Jane Andrews was my president, and I was her class president, meaning chair of the governor class. So I was in constant contact with her throughout her year, and I can attest to the kind of pushback that she had. She had tremendous pushback within the organization and on her board. A lot of it because she was a woman.
Sounds like a bit like the double bind that women face, right? Kind of moving in. So you have to be, so women who tend to be more agentic and have more leadership qualities tend to be judged more harshly, right? Because of the expectation. Actually, I'm doing some research on it now. It's really kind of fascinating. And then I'm not even talking about laying over things like race or other stuff like that. I'm not even coming to the question yet, but that adds a whole other triple dimension. Somebody else was going to mention something.
I was just going to respond to Phil. I think some of us, some of the women, some of the things that we've faced, I was a district trainer and got feedback that why if there are that many women in Kiwanis, why are women doing the training? And the other thing that I had happen was that I had a governor tell me, or in an email that got forwarded to me when I was 2 weeks postpartum and I was going to go do a training. He's like, well, if she's coming, I'm going to follow. If she really says she's going to be in I'm sure that's what she's going to do. And I walked out. I walked out of Kiwanis for a while because I felt like if you say you want women, but you don't. So I mean there are definitely some strides that I don't think that some of our members don't realize, and I have members that don't hear my voice because it's female.
Oh, boy.
Maybe there's a lot of inclusion work that needs to happen.
A lot of inclusion work, and I think we gloss over it. We have made great strides with the presidents that we've had that are female. Those are truly I sometimes think are true leaders, servant leaders. But I don't think all of that always gets shown. I've shared that story a few times, but it really made me like, why am I in an organization that doesn't want, that they say they want women and we're an asset to the organization, but we really don't sometimes.
And I think that's where we can do a better job of employing the allyship, because I've heard people like in our district say, well, I'm not happy with leadership, so I'm not going to run. Well, wait a minute now. How can you change the leadership if you have, you need to run, and we need some, if that's the attitude, we need to change, say, you're not in it by yourself. We support you, and we want you to run so that leadership can change and the attitudes can change. I don't think we're active enough in that arena to really support the people that are looking to make changes in this area.
Yeah,
Well, I don't necessarily believe in goals, but I believe governors in Eastern Canada and the Caribbean, 1 year should be a man and the next year should be a woman. And the third year, it should be a person of color. And that takes leadership at the district level to say that and to put that into the rules. So that sort of tells people that we're serious about this inclusiveness. That's the rule. That's how it's going to be, guys. Guys to me is generic, by the way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an interesting, I mean, whether you can pull that off or not, like sort of legally is another question, Mary Ellen, but the idea of like sort of actively promoting, like, for example, a way to actively promote a presentation, a really good practice that looks at inviting people with disabilities, right? Or even people who are neurodiverse would be for us to take this presentation and say, if you need American Sign Language, if you need interpretation, if you know you need closed captioning, let us know. We'll make that available to you, right? It's an automatic kind of sign that we're including communities that often get forgotten, right? At these vantage points. Now, we took care of that in the beginning. I just want to say that. But I mean, if we were to open this up to others, I'd want to make sure that your consultants were doing that and opening up that voice to everybody, because it really is what we should, and that's kind of a really simple way to be more inclusive. Is like, let us know if you need closed captioning. Let us know if you need this. There are other ways that you can do that to invite, you know, sort of minoritized voices to the table. Like you could take a look at your policies and see where they may be failing. Talk to your former leaders along the lines of what Phil was saying, and saying, what was it in particular? Was it the microaggressions? Was it a policy that in particular that didn't favor women or that favored certain group over others? There are ways to do that work. And then this might be a really great way for us to have structure our conversations for those of you that opt in to talk to me over the next year about how we may be able to sort of look at that. I wanted to, just before we continue, I know we can continue to discuss this, but I want to highlight and uplift some voices in the chat. So Gail was saying, I think this was answering the question of best practice, that I'm affiliated with a local college. It's currently working on a new strategic plan and it's centered on DEI. I've been privileged to sit on some of the faculty staff town halls, and between that process and these sessions, it's been quite the eye opener and helpful in my growth and understanding of DEI issues. So talk about lifelong learning. Thanks a lot, Gail, for that. And then trying to get through the chat here. There's something from Michelle. Yeah, there's always more to learn through networking, workshops, conferences, conversations, and others. And like Phil mentioned, having the confidence to openly express my convictions, continuing to find ways to develop yourself and value and bring value to the organization. Thanks, Sue, for putting that question out there. Kim saying we've implemented blind hiring for recruiting. I removed the candidate's name, address, grad year, et cetera, from applications so that the hiring manager is choosing candidates on experience, skills. So this idea of removing kind of the obvious, I mean, that's been happening. Just by way of example, my daughter is a violinist and my son's a pianist, and all their testing, they get all these juries and everything in their musical careers, and they're all done behind screens, right? So that the adjudicators or the juries are not actually seeing it, you know, anything about gender, race, or anything, and they get marked based on just the sound. That simple practice changed the way music was played in orchestras, and it changed the sort of, not necessarily inclusion, but definitely the diversity of orchestras in the US. I mean, I think it started about 15 or 20 years ago. There's a real kind of groundswell for the music industry. Roger's saying our club is in a community that is a majority BIPOC, yet the club is majority white, right? It's a failure that must move beyond the conversation stage and see the changes that are appealing to these other groups. And then Gail's saying, yeah, we need to work harder at being inclusive. My club division is pretty similar, but we're working hard on just this issue. Our leadership is becoming more diverse, which is very helpful in diversifying our club. Yeah, that's definitely when leadership starts changing, and the commitment often starts changing as well. Absolutely. There's something from Renee. Trying to read everybody's. I think Renee was just commenting, and then inclusiveness in Kiwanis from Roger can largely be driven by our leaders and how they, exactly what I was saying, Roger. So yeah, absolutely, right? When leadership sets the tone, it's amazing how things happen pretty quickly. So thank you for that. And keep going on so we can continue to talk about this.
Sorry, Neil, Linda has her hand up.
Oh yeah, Linda, sorry, go ahead. I can't really see all that's going on, so.
That's all right, no worries. Just a quick comment that a lot of these changes do have to be intentional. It doesn't happen by accident. I think, as some have said, there has to be a plan, and you have to work the plan. Now, you may not be able to make it part of bylaws or laws of organizations initially, but you can have conversations with interested individuals and bring about a plan for change. One of the clubs that I helped to develop the line of leadership that's coming along, vice president, president-elect, president. We looked at our community, we looked at the diversity, and the slate we're presenting this year to that club has an Asian woman coming in as the president of the club. It has another woman coming in as the president-elect. It has a Black woman coming in as the vice president. And the club, which is largely elderly male members, are 90%, and I'm not going to say 100%, 90% behind this move into where this club needs to go in order to flourish.
That's great. Yeah, and you'll start seeing changes, right? When look at, you're right, the commitment, the sustainability of this, the strategicness of this, that's all tied to kind of this. And it's not something, interestingly enough, we tend to tie to DEI. Like, again, I know I'm going to sound like a bit like a broken record, but DEI in most organizations tends to be an afterthought. It's something we apply after the fact. So the problem with applying anything after the fact, if you're not involved in those initial discussions, like how do you begin to even like work it and bake it into the cake, right? Because it's sort of like, kind of like a hiring process. If you invite me in as your DEI specialist after the ad's out, after the committee's been struck, I can't really help you at that point. But if you invite me into the conversation beforehand and we work out on goals, we talk about how your systems might promote certain outcomes, even unintentionally, then let's have a serious conversation about what that looks like. So I love what you said, Linda. It's tying in exactly to this idea of making this sort of as strategically important as anything else. And even when we talk about strategic planning, making sure the DEI is front and center and part of it. So we get into finally, so since I'm kind of ripping off this sort of Star Wars theme, right, of the Jedi. So a Jedi, this ties in nicely into what you just talked about. So like a Jedi individual action plan, and by Jedi, I mean justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, right? Here's an interesting one, because what we've done is we've broken it up into a way that looks at the similar action plan from the lens of a white identified woman and a Black identified woman. The topic here is leadership or gender equality, right? Both people with these very different lenses are looking at sort of what the individual action plan might look like. So a goal, for example, for a white woman coming into this might be to amplify the voices of people of color. From a Black identified perspective, it might be navigating a pathway to become a leader in an organization or organizations. The reality from a white woman's perspective might look like this: how my own privileges and biases mask these Jedi realities. From a Black identified woman, it might be looking at, the reality might be how I experience systemic disadvantages that need to be navigated within an organization. Obstacles from both different vantage points, like from the vantage point of a white woman might be, I need further growth in my learning of race and racism. I need to actively listen to colleagues and be open to being challenged and to learning, right? Continuing to learn. From a Black woman, it might be needing to find buy-in and support in the organization for pipeline to leadership. The will or the action is part of this work, right? Again, from these two lenses. On the one side, it would be actively listening to colleagues and inviting them to challenge and educating them further to advocate for racially diverse voices so those can be amplified and uplifted. And again, from this other vantage point, it might be to resist replicating racist systems and continue to find support towards towards goals. So again, the plan is really, it's looking, I'm presenting it to you intersectionally so that you can see what two perspectives might look like, and that's intentional, right? Because the plan is supposed to reflect on the behavior changes you want to make by using a growth and mindfulness model, but also kind of comes from the idea of how you stand within the organization and how you're placed within it. So the plan really guides you, and this is just a real simple one that you can totally use to sort of how you set goals, what are your reality checks in terms of sort of how you represent in this space, what obstacles do you think you might face, right? And what specific action are going to help you to achieve whatever goal, for example, to amplify voices of people of color. Laying all those will help you in building kind of these strategic, bringing more strategy into the world of DEI, and then sort of taking this into community of practice and encouraging your cohort to say, all right, here's our goal, right? How are we going to build the KPIs or whatever you want to call around this? What are the obstacles we're going to face? Let's tackle all those in a systematic way, particularly as we have an eye towards baking this into the cake, right? This work into the cake of our organization. So we talked about the individual action plan, and then I have a sample organizational action plan. And Mary Ellen, I hope this is okay, but I've used our LGBTQ+ group and the village using as an example about what organizationally this might look like. So in this case, our goal was to create an LGBTQ plus affinity group, right, within the Kiwanis model. The impact statement here was to allow this affinity group to be supportive, to could do more inclusive sort of service learning projects, to build this environment. And again, I'm ad-libbing a little bit here, that build the organization's diversity, culture, as well as new channels for creating change, right? And we talk about the domains of organizational change here was like culture and leadership works clearly at the center of this, and Mary Ellen was at the sort of head of it. Action steps for this group, right, were to figure out a recruitment strategy. So we needed to get to that magic number 15. We just talked about it on Monday night and what that would look like. Another action step for us was to plan training, meeting to recruit other interested parties. Another action step was to determine the communication and the scope of the affinity work group. So how we were going to present, what kind of logo we were going to use, what kind of social media outlets we were going to replicate this work on. Our accountability were tied to different people. We're working that out right now. So assigned staff members would each have different pieces of this puzzle. And our performance measures we're going to be working out. But for example, our recruitment strategy will be like, what is our key performance indicator number 1, getting to 15? When are we going to do that? How are we going to set our timelines for what we do? How are we going to decide on service learning projects? We talk about retention, culture, sense of belonging that's embedded, although we're not naming it, we're talking about that as part of this work. So what everybody brings to it. And then of course we have deadlines, right? In this case, I had an arbitrary May 1st, but I think, and Mary Ellen, I don't know what date we decided for I think we said we'd give ourselves a month. Yeah.
We're hoping to have something announced by July, because
By
the
July.
last week of June and the first week of July is Pride Month in Toronto.
Yeah, so we're tying it, so like all these things that are sort of being organizationally, we're thinking about organizationally, like Pride Month, we talked about Mother's Day, we talked about all these other places for us to kind of begin to think about how this work can bring intentionality into the community. We're connecting with other organizations, right? We've done a lot of that work as well. And there's already been 2 successes in Mary Ellen. Do you want to talk about them? The 2 great
Well-
letters you received?
Well, one of the other clubs within the GTA had a wonderful idea for service project for Mother's Day, and that is that they were going to deliver a package to a woman's shelter. So each woman within that shelter would receive a Mother's Day present from the Kiwanis Club. So because we're in lockdown, it's not easy to do this. So what we did was we contacted some friends of ours, and an organization that has emergency medical supplies donated to this shelter on behalf of the Village Club. I think it was 300 adults masks, 150 kids masks, and a package of the cloaks that kids or that the parents wear. And they now are in a total lockdown, this woman's shelter, and they're all in hotel rooms. So not only did we provide them with masks and things, we also provided them with hand sanitizers. It's just an absolutely wonderful thing to do for Mother's Day. And they were absolutely thrilled and amazed that we pulled this off. So that's our first service project on behalf of the Village Club.
So you met your first KPI.
Yes, indeed.
Good for you. So again, another example, and you'll obviously have access to these. These are simple sort of, organizational plans about how we can implement this work in a sustainable and systemic way, as opposed to, I know one of the things that we talked about a lot in our group was just getting beyond performative, right? And actually doing of this work and kind of how we tell that story. I think I might have mentioned this. There's a funny story of a really good friend who does DI work at the University of Pennsylvania. And sort of the issue there is that, I forget how they put it, but they spend maybe about $1 million on DEI initiatives, but they spend $3 million on telling everybody how great they are at doing DEI. So again, right, like a ratio of 1 to whatever, 3 or 1 to 4. But so here, real quick, I'm sensitive to time. I know we've got a few more minutes, but I wanted to get over this because we're at our last few slides. So here's a letter from Pennsylvania State College, from the School of Forestry, March 21st, 1957. Just to give you some context, right? I'll read it out loud and then I just want to ask us to unpack it real quickly. I want you all to start applying your equity lens to kind of what we're seeing here. So the letter goes, this is to acknowledge receipt of your letter dated March 11th. We have never in the past had a girl enrolled in the School of Forestry and for specific reasons. First of all, the number of jobs that are available for a woman in forestry are limited entirely to clerical type of jobs for which a background in forestry would not be necessary. Secondary, the requirements in specific courses in the School of Forestry curriculum are such that it would pose a definite problem as far as a girl is concerned. In many instances, the students are required to go out on a day-long and weekend field trips where they share the same eating and sleeping facilities. You can readily see the problem involved here. Last, we require that a student complete 6 months of satisfactory experience in the field of forestry, and we do not accept 2 years as a forest lookout, which is the only temporary job currently available to women in the type of employment that we would accept as fulfilling the requirement. Very truly yours, the management. All right, take it away, somebody. What's wrong with this letter?
Wow and wow. I seriously had to look at the date. Was like, when was this? Because this is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a real letter, actually.
Holy cow. Wow.
Saying that it's limited to women because of clerical type jobs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
All this
That
sort of
girl.
policy.
Okay, this is 1957. Where are they at today?
That's a really good
Right.
question. We'll have to ask them to do a new letter, right? This is actually a letter that came out of the Oregon Search Advocate training. They do this thing on bias in the search process, and they've created this role called the Search Advocate. The idea is that this person gets imbued, and I'm trying to get Michelle to get through it because I've been through it as well, so that we sit in on basically every search committee to interrupt these biases as they happen. Because what we know, right, is that the job gets posted, and then there's all this in between stuff that happens. That it's kind of like the jury. Nobody knows what happens, and then a candidate gets chosen. It's like that interesting gray period, gray area is a really, really important piece of the puzzle when you're looking at how bias gets introduced into the processes. Like they start looking at things that don't even have any bearing on what we were looking for in the first place. So the idea of these Oregon Search Advocates is that they have that sort of critical DEI eye to say, hold on, you're talking about this person's ability to like cook brownies when that's not part of, I'm totally extrapolating right now. That wasn't even part of what you were looking for in the first place. So I'm going to call you on that. This comes out of that work. And I thought it was an interesting way for us to say, wow, okay, this is a really simple way. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things you're going to pick up on, but there's some more subtle. More recently at the university, I adjudicated a case for a young white male who identified as non-binary. And he didn't necessarily want to be bunked with men as they were going on a field trip to, I think it was Costa Rica. But somebody said to him, well, you're a boy, so you're going to be with the boys. And he's like, well, hold on, right? And it opened up this whole interesting discussion about gender identity and how he self-identified. Very difficult.
I want to say something about this letter. Can you imagine if they did let her in? That's what you talk
Right.
about, invited to the party, but that's just the way the environment would be and the culture would not be inclusive at all.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's just, and that's what happens a lot of times in today's workplace in the organization is that, yeah, we'll let you in, and it might not be the whole organization, but it might be a part of the organization. And that you might as well have sent this letter because that's how that person's going to feel when they get there.
And that's the question, Gail, exactly, of like, people say, well, look, we've hired somebody, or like our provost is Black or our dean is Black. Sure, but like, are they going to stay because the sense of belonging exists? Like that is the next obvious question. Again, diversity is very different than inclusion, is very different than equity. And it's very different than justice. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I wouldn't want to live in this Pennsylvania State College School of Forestry program at all.
I love how too they say you can readily see the program, you can readily see the problem involved here.
Right.
Like they don't want to say exactly, but like,
Yeah.
no, you obviously have a problem with it, but she obviously didn't because she applied.
Right. How they even knew she was a girl, even like I didn't get that from, but I imagine like there was a time way back when actually your pictures would go on your resume too. I
Mhm.
still saw that in the medical field for a while. I don't have that information. I'll have to ask Anne at Oregon when I see her next, but thanks for engaging me with me in that.
That's-
I'll try to get the outcome for you next time.
Being a human resources professional, a lot of times for the succession planning on their applications or their, what do I want to call it? The technology that they have set up, a lot of times they do have pictures and they're considering, you know, someone's going to be promoted or not. And I mean, we had a lot of discussions on why you can't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, can you imagine? Just
Yeah.
the implicit bias that just gets brought up with that, like, oh, geez. Well. So,
Back in the 57s, my sister was applying for a job as a teacher, and she couldn't wear her engagement ring because they would assume she was going to get pregnant and not teach anymore. So they weren't going to hire those people to begin with. And that was that era. It was, you know, at that time, women were to be teachers or nurses. That was their choice, or secretaries.
wow, I worked in downtown Toronto in the, gosh, it was just around high school days. So this must have been the 80s, mid 80s. And I worked for one of my very first jobs is actually for Toyota, which is on, for those of you that are sort of downtowners, it was sort of on, I believe it was on Queen Street at the time. But I was told my very first day of my job, it said I could only wear skirts. Women didn't wear pants at Toyota.
Mhm.
This was the 80s. So
One of my teacher friends got sent home because she wore a pantsuit.
yeah. Yeah, the work continues, right? Let's just say that, Fran. So, right, when I asked you, this goes back to our very first session about sort of, we had this really, really rich discussion about kind of what you wanted out of this space. Right, it really tied back to these three pillars of connection, collaboration, and consideration. So you all developed that, helped me develop that. So all this reflect, comfort, continuity, honor, and respect, learning and give, which is obviously tied in line with the work you're doing with Kiwanis as well, right? The kind of service learning, what you offer sort of in your space. So I wanted to come back to that because I wanted to make sure that we're meeting your goals, right? That you feel supported, that you feel comforted, that there's some continuity, which hopefully we're going to do with the offer to opt in today. That you feel like you have community support and people to go to, that you're learning and giving, that you're building on your knowledge bank. You're vulnerable, which is really important in this work too, right? Sort of identifying, right? And that's why we keep going back to these community norms and this idea of fumbling forward. We're not always going to get it right. And this idea of reflection, right? And courage that we really need to do this work. So thank you for that. And I'll come back to that a lot too, particularly as we close up on our next community of practice. So I did, and I'm pretty sure this code works if you want to scan, but for those of you that do want, and I will continue to do this over the next year, but for those of you that want to continue to learn, I will avail myself of you in the ways that I mentioned, but I also want to create this shared drive that I could give to Sue so that you can continue to learn and we can add to it. So please, if you feel that you've got anything to add, you can go to Menti and enter this code. There's the HTTPS. Or just scan just put your camera over this little picture right now, this QR code, and that'll take you right to it. So where you can put anything you want in there about what you want to see in this shared resources list. I'll send that to Sue as well. And then as a last bit, we have homework. We always have homework, right? Wouldn't be a community of practice without it. So there's two things I want you to do for next session, and we're going to turn the tables, as they say, right? Sort of flip the classroom. So in groups of 2, I'm going to assign, maybe even 3, I'm going to assign you a bias area. And what I want you to do is research it and be prepared to provide us with a very, very simple presentation that includes a definition, how the bias plays out in real life, and how you think knowing about this bias might make you more equity-minded. As homework number 2, I want you all, and this will only take a few minutes, and I promise not more than 15, if all you want to do is 1 or 2, is to take the Harvard Implicit Association test and be prepared to talk about it at our next session if you feel comfortable doing. There are many tests you can do: disability, or Muslim, gender, transgender, sexuality, weight, race. You can choose one. All I'm asking you is choose one, but if you want to do more, you'd be willing to talk about it. There is the address for it. Now, the next two slides. So here's the bias areas. And I'm hoping you all volunteer, and this will be really simple, and I'll just keep track of names so that we make sure that you all have. So again, I'm going to close it up a little bit. Can you all still see that? So I wonder if you want to do this in the chat, or if you want to, I can monitor the chat. Oh, Julia already took one of these. So great, Julia, be ready. You have part 2 of homework done. So you have these here. I would like to see if I can get 2 or 3 of you each to one of these areas. If there's anything you already know about, even better. But if not, or if you want to challenge yourself and say, hey, I've never heard about the backfire effect. So, or if you want me to just name, I don't know what works for all of you. What do you think's better? I'm gonna open up the floor.
You name us.
Assign me one.
Me too. You assign me one.
All right, so.
Of course, based on personality, right?
Sorry?
Nothing, never mind.
So I'm just gonna go in the number and the name that I'm seeing. All right, so the Dunning-Kruger effect, all right? I've got Carolyn and Roger. And then I've got confirmation bias. The next person I have on my screen is Gordon Meth and Jewel Williams. Yeah. All right. Self-serving bias. I've got Renee and Fran. The curse of knowledge bias. I've got Sue and Mary Ellen. And then I've got optimism, pessimism bias. I've got Lori and Greg Smith. All right. And then I've got the sunk cost fallacy bias. And I've got, I've got Kathleen and Gary Graham. Okay. And then I've got negativity bias. I've got the next person I have is Gail and Jill. Then I have declinism.
Which Gail? Which Gail? I'm sorry.
Gail Spurl. Sorry, Gail.
That's right.
The Gail. Sorry, Gail B versus Gail S. All right, I've got Jill, I've got you with Gail Spurl, Jill Mason. All right. And then declinism, Michelle, how about you take that on? With Leah. And then the backfire effect, I've got Gail Bonner and Mark Brannon. And then fundamental attribution error, I've got Joe and Chris. And then in-group bias, I've got Chris. So I've got Chris, I've got you with Joe, right? Chris White on the fundamental, right? And then in-group bias, I've got Linda and Linda Lothar and Phil, if that's okay. And then the forever effect, the Barnum effect. All right, I've got Lanton, and I'm just reading off the way your shell's showing up on the screen. Lanton and Rhonda. So I've got a bunch of you that I haven't done, so I'm going to give you, I'm just going to read the names. So Craig Smith, can I put you on the sunk cost? Okay. Teresa, can I put you on negativity? Charles, Chuck, I can put you on declinism.
Thank you.
Okay. Ginny, I'm going to put you on backfire effect. Richard, I'm going to put you on in-group, Richard Olmsted. Susan, I'm going to put you on the fundamental attribution error with Joe and Chris. Susan Denning. Tina, I'm going to put you on self-serving bias, Tina Z. Alan Medwick, I'm going to put you on the Dunning-Kruger with Carolyn and Roger. And then I've got Alan Alan Medwick, I'm going to put you on cursive knowledge with Sue and Mary Ellen. And then optimism, pessimism bias, Barbara Holstein. I think I've got everybody now, right? Y'all want to read back? I'm just going to go by name and I'm just going to get you to tell me what your area is, if that's okay, as we're closing out for today. So Carolyn, you're doing which one? Carolyn Dwyer. The Dunning-Kruger effect, you're on mute, Carolyn.
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Absolutely. Roger Bell.
Did he leave us?
Oh, he's
So
there.
if you guys, if
Roger?
everyone wants to go ahead and unmute, there you go.
Yes.
Yeah. Roger, which one are you doing?
I thought I was on the confirmation.
You're doing Dunning-Kruger with Carolyn,
Oh, okay,
all right?
okay.
Perfect. And then Jewel, which one are you doing?
Confirmation bias.
That's right. Perfect. And then Renee, which one did I assign to you?
Self-serving bias.
Yeah. Fran?
Self-serving bias.
Perfect. Sue?
Cursive knowledge and hindsight.
That's right. Mary Ellen?
Cursive knowledge and hindsight.
Right. Lori Lee?
Optimism, pessimism, bias.
Perfect. Greg Smith?
Same one, optimism, pessimism.
Perfect. Kathleen?
The sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah. Phil Rossi?
In-group bias.
All right, perfect. And then let me get to the next one now. Gary Graham, which one do I have you on?
The sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, great. Gail Spurl?
Negativity bias.
Jill Mason?
Negativity bias.
Michelle Benscook?
Declinism.
Yeah. Gail Bonner?
Backfire effect.
Leah Moretz?
Declinism.
Mark Brannon?
Backfire effect.
Joe C?
For me,
Yeah.
fundamental attribution error.
Chris White?
Fundamental attribution error bias.
Lanton, do I have you assigned to something?
Yeah, the Forer effect, the Barnum effect.
Barnum effect, yeah. Ginny Carroll?
Backfire effect.
Perfect. Who have I missed? Linda?
I have the in-group bias with Phil Rossi and Dick Olmsted.
Okay. Craig Smith. I don't know if you're there, Craig.
Yeah, I am. I have the sunk cost fallacy.
Okay. Rhonda Vrell?
I am with Lanton Lee in the forever effect or the Barnum effect.
Perfect. Charles?
The decline bias or
Declinism. Yeah. Richard O?
In-group bias.
Okay. Susan Denning? I don't know if we can hear you, Susan, but you're on the fundamental attribution. I have this, hopefully I've got all this right. And then Tina Z, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Self-serving bias.
Perfect. Thank you, Tina. Alan Medwick?
Yeah, so I was writing down Dunning-Kruger, but then I heard my name again and there was another one. So I'm not sure which one.
Okay. So Alan, I think I have you on cursive knowledge, don't I?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
And
I think that
Barbara-
might have been the second one you mentioned.
Yeah, sorry about that. I might have seen your name. And then Barbara?
No worries.
I can, what do you have her on? I can help.
Barbara should be optimism, pessimism.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
Thank you. That's absolutely right. So we'll just make sure Barbara knows that.
Yep.
All right, so there's some of you that are 3, some of you that are, I think I've got 3 for most, but in any case. So again, the homework is really kind of to understand, give us a real quick view
You
of
go
what,
back
how the bias plays out.
Can you go back to the screen? Had the, what we're supposed to do with this?
Yeah, let me do that.
And I have been recording this, so I can go back as well with the list.
And I'm on the negativity bias.
That was Teresa, who's on the negativity bias.
So here are the three, here are the more than three. Here are the biases we were talking about. So the idea really is to, what did I say about them? I want to make sure I gave you all the right. So in groups of three, I think, which we arrange, I want you to research it. You should be able to get something really simple like Wikipedia or some other DI resource. Be prepared to provide us with the definition, who it's attributed to, right? And how the bias plays out in real life. So just three things. I'll put that into the homework that I give to Sue.
Well, it's on the screen before. It's on the slide before.
Yeah, that's right.
You bring
There
that
you
up.
go. And how knowing about this bias might make you more equity minded. And then again, the second piece of that was to take the Harvard Implicit Association test, right? And be prepared to talk about your results if you feel comfortable doing that at our next session. Yeah, you felt about it. Sort of what it brings up, what you learn from it. Does that make sense for our last session together? Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Are there any questions right now before? If you have
Nelia,
any questions about the assignment, let me know because I've already got it done. So.
Nelia, you go back one slide for the, yes, that's one. Thank you.
So I'm going to try my phone. If you just hover your camera over it, for those of you that have a smartphone, you should be able to go right to it. I'm just going to make sure it works because last time.
It did.
Yay, that's great.
You put the instructions back up. I'm going to copy that one.
Yeah.
You have to get my phone. Okay. Too lazy to write it. Thank you.
Can I go back to the QR code now, Fran?
Sure.
All right. Oops. There we go. Yeah, and if there's
Nelia.
anything you want to know more about, it does work. Yay. Go ahead, Greg.
I had to break away to join a Kiwanis call for a few minutes. What is the purpose of the code there, and what will help us do?
So the code really goes to that question. So I want to create a shared drive where you can share resources as a group. And really what the question for you is when you use that code, and it'll take you to this quick survey called menti.com. What I want to know is what are some of the topics you'd like resources on? So for example, you want to know more about how to create a DI strategic plan for a nonprofit. It's something I can research for you and give you in terms of information. That's what I'm hoping to do and leave you with so that you can continue to learn.
Thank you very much.
Is there anything that's not clear? I know I'm a few minutes over, but willing to stay if anybody needs any help.
And I will make sure that I get all this information out to you within the next, I will do my best to get it out to you by this weekend before the Kiwanis Cafe starts. And maybe I'll do it Saturday.
You'll be connecting. I'm looking for really exciting presentations. This is going to be like your
How long is this next session? Like 4 hours?
That might be a good thing. Like maybe we're going to keep it to less than 5 minutes. So.
I want to know, I mean, who's going to put their costumes on, right? We want to go out.
I want creativity, just saying. We're joking, but seriously, the idea is so that we learn about sort of how some of these biases play out, and then we become a little bit familiar with some of the terminology. It's really just about that. I know when I learned about declinism, I'm like, wow, okay, that's what it's called. That's how it plays out. Negativity bias is also a really, really important one too. So great, thank you all. It's just such a great group. It's been such a pleasure working with you. We've got one more of these sessions, and then I'm going to lay out that offer to Sue so that for those of you that want to opt in, I know a lot of you put into the chat that you will, so to keep the community of practice going. Yeah, Wonder Woman costumes are coming out, it sounds like, so.
Neil, yeah, do you have a couple of minutes after this? Can I stay on?
I'll stay on, absolutely. For those of you that need to go, and please, thank you for staying a few minutes behind. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Terrific.
Have a great month. If you need anything, get a hold of me. I'll be working on this probably tonight. Or tomorrow, whenever Nelia gets you this stuff. Give me a couple days.
Phil, I
Bye.
really did have that costume, but I recently threw it away as we're downsizing
Aw.
things.
Oh, wow.
I have a
Time for an upgrade.
I have a Sparty Superman costume.
I have a Wonder Woman cape I could send to somebody if they want.
you
It'll
go.
last you too. The original Wonder Woman.
I have some fabric that says Wonder Woman and Superwoman on it. There you go.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna let's see, what time is it? Nelia, I'm gonna make you the host
Okay, perfect.
so that I can cruise to a dentist appointment.
Thanks you.
Thanks. I'll be in
for all
touch.
Thanks for all your organizational skills.
Hey, no problem. We'll be in touch. See ya.
Bye-bye.
I just don't want to be late for the dentist.
Yes.
I don't know who needed me, but I'll stay behind.
It was for Gail.
Oh, hey, Gail.